Okay, today is August 12th, and we're standing here with Pam Gray. How are you doing today, Pam?
Good.
Great.
Thanks for coming.
Well, we're standing in the Illinois State Fair Museum, and I have a couple questions for you about the State Fair, but let's start with some of the easier ones first. Can you kind of tell me your age, date of birth, and where you were born?
Okay. I was born in Streator, Illinois,
Okay.
and I am 54 years old.
Okay.
So I got a birthday coming up in October. I'll be 55, the big 5'5".
Well, great. So you're the director of the Illinois State Fair Museum.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of tell us how you got into that position, how you ended up getting that position?
Sure. About 15 years ago, there was a small ad in the local newspaper, and it just said volunteers needed for the State Fair. And so I came out here. There was only about 5 of us that showed up, and on the day that we showed up, the lady that put the ad in the paper that worked for agriculture said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we couldn't get it organized in time, so we're going to have to pay you." And it was like, well, that's not what I wanted. I can go anywhere and get a part-time job, and I really wanted to do volunteer work because I believe in volunteerism. I believe in the social aspects of volunteerism and all that. So I was very disappointed, but she said, I went ahead and worked 3 days. That's all that it was required. And while I was working, I was really even more disappointed when the person that I was supposed to work with, again, we're both being paid now because it's not volunteering, we're being paid as a real job. And the person that I was working with showed up an hour and a half late. It was a high school person, and we were working in the information booth, and whenever a fairgoer would come by and ask where something was, he would just kind of lean down on the counter and say, "Well, I just really don't know. You can walk down that way and see if it's down there." And it was just so disappointing to me. And so from that point on, I decided, well, we need to change this. So one of the ladies that works at agriculture saw in me that I was very, I was disappointed that in human nature that the person would be so lackadaisical about the whole job thing. He's getting paid. And so Suzanne Moss from the Department of Agriculture asked me if I would be interested in volunteering and running the volunteer program for the next year.
Yeah.
So that was 14 years ago. And I said, yes, I will. I jumped up and down with the opportunity. I thought, this is my opportunity to do that. So I was in school at the time, in college, taking courses in public administration, so I was interested in that type of work. So I started working on it as soon as the fair got over that year, and I just kind of got myself organized. I contacted the media outlets, and I said, we have a volunteer program now this year. And so they did some interviews with us, and we got some people applying. And that first year we had about 45 people. The first year, which was 14 years ago. This is 2008. It was 14 years ago that I had the first volunteer program.
Wow. And now you just kind of worked your way from volunteer coordinator into director of the Fair Museum?
Well, the transition there was the first year, that 14 years ago, the volunteers, we were putting signs up, pictures in the Artisans Building. What happened was Suzanne, who was the volunteer coordinator, she called me and said, it was parade night, Thursday night before the fair started that year, and she said, "Can you help me tape some photographs in an area about where we're standing here, literally a 10 by 10 area in the Artisans Building?" And because they found file cabinets full of 8 by 10 glossies in the basement of the Big Ag Building. And the reason they found them was they're putting in new air conditioning ducts in that area. And Suzanne thought, well, this is something that fairgoers would like to see. So she arranged for a small area. We met there on that Thursday night, and we literally just took Scotch tape and started taping them on the walls at about eye level. And it was a long day. We'd been working up there, and Suzanne had some things she put out in a display case, some mugs and things that were just just things that she had in her personal collection. And while we were doing that, it was about 8 o'clock that night, a gentleman tapped me on the shoulder, and I was, literally taping things on the wall. He tapped me on my shoulder, and he said, "Ma'am, can you help me?" And I thought, he said, "Can I show you something?" And I was like, okay, I'm really busy, but I'll take the time out. And it was an older man, and he took me over to an area where I had just taped photographs on the wall. And he pointed to the photograph, an 8x10 glossy black and white photograph, and he pointed to the center of it, and he said, "That's my son." And I just got goosebumps, because the photograph was of President Nixon standing on a platform where he was getting ready to speak, and he was reaching down from the platform to a group of about 12 young boys, about 16 years old. Oh, wow. And the boys were all reaching up, trying to shake his hand, and right when they were just about ready to shake, the photograph was snapped.
Oh, wow.
And all the boys had on black slacks and white shirts tucked in, little bow ties, and the gentleman said to me, "I didn't know that this photo existed," or we didn't know that this photo existed, and it was of his son. And I got so excited. I said, "Oh, you're going to have to bring your son in, tell him about this photograph." And the man just hung his head down, and he, with a tear in his eye, he said, "My son died in the war."
Oh.
So literally, short time after that photograph was taken, this boy died in the very war that President Nixon was involved in. And I literally got goosebumps, and that moment was pivotal for me, because I thought, you know what, that's why I spent all day taping these on the wall and getting this all organized. And that's, and this man didn't know that the photograph existed of his son that died in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So we made sure that the gentleman got a copy of that photograph after the fair. And I hugged the man, and we were just like, I literally had goosebumps. I was just so excited. I thought, you know what, this is real. This is what it's about. It's about the people. It's not necessarily about that photograph of all the people in the photograph, but it is the people, the one person that was getting ready to shake his hand, and the story that continues to go on some 25 years later.
Yeah.
So I have a story like that every year, because the next year after that experience, we expanded it to not just an 8x8 or 10x10. We tripled in size. We were like a 30x20. I spent the year working on getting more photographs. I spent more time. I had volunteers to come and help us so we could get more information out, such as that story. And we had such a huge crowd every year. People would just flock in by the dozens, and admiring all the black and white photos that we had. The Department of Agriculture, the State Fair, helped me get more photographs. People saw what we were doing, and they donated mugs.
Oh, wow.
I had a couple of displays that were loaned to us the first few years, and it became so popular that we moved from the Artisans Building to the south end of the grandstand in a little bit bigger area, but still not the entire area. And every year it just got bigger and bigger. And here we are 14 years later from that very first experience, and we take the entire north end of the grandstand.
Wow.
And it's a very, very popular area. People really enjoy the photographs and the memorabilia that we have.
Well, that's great. That's really cool. So I imagine you're the lady to talk to about fair history then.
Yeah.
So
yes.
Can we kind of talk a little bit about some of the history of the fair?
Sure.
When did it start?
The first Illinois State Fair was October 11th, 1853.
Okay.
Its agricultural base is the whole idea behind the State Fair in 1853. Farmers at that time, literally, it was manual labor to produce the hundreds or thousands of acres of agriculture that they produced. So at the time, the thinking was, from a university capacity, which is the University of Illinois, individuals said, let's put on a fair and gather the farmers from the areas and look at what we would consider today best practice. What's working, what's not, what do we do, you know, for different, whether it's beans or corn or livestock, cattle, horses, whatever it is at the time, because that's what it was about in 1853.
Yeah.
So that was the idea, and it was a 4-day fair. It was held in Springfield. It was put together rather quickly, but they managed to do it. And so that was such a huge success. They were able to get the Chicago Tribune on board, and they did a small ad. I have copies of those ads. I do research year-round to gather information, especially about the early years. I wanted to find out exactly who were the key individuals that got the fair together. And so for the first few years, 40-some years, up until 1894, the fair was a traveling fair because you couldn't get in your vehicle, jump on the interstate, and go to Springfield to the fair.
Exactly.
So they took the fair to the farmers, literally. They had a 2-year run here in Springfield, which would have been 1853 and 1854. And then they traveled. They went to Chicago for 2 years. They went to Ottawa, Illinois for 2 years. They went to Centralia for 2 years.
Wow.
We went to Alton for 2 years, Quincy for 2 years, literally getting the fair out because they couldn't come to us, you know, here. So then if you go forward 40-ish years to the 1894, people were starting to realize, well, maybe we need to have a permanent place because every town we go to, we put up the tents, we have areas, you know, designated, and it changes every year, so it's just somewhat different and a little chaotic in every location that we go to. But if we had a permanent place, we can always put the cattle barns in one area. Every year the horses will be shown in one area, and people will know which area. We can put farming implement in one area, and so that was the thinking there in 1894 when they decided, let's try to get a permanent place.
Yeah.
They'd worked on it for several years. They put the word out, and they said, Chicago, what can you offer us if we have the State Fair in Chicago? Peoria, what can you offer us if we have the permanent fair, Illinois State Fair, in your town? Springfield, what can you offer us? Quincy. And so there was a real bidding war going on for several years up until the decision was made by looking at what all of the cities could offer. And Springfield won out.
Really?
Yes.
Do you know what Springfield was able to offer?
Well, they offered the land.
Okay.
They offered free water, which was a huge thing in that time.
Definitely.
And that was the main offer. A good central location, or a location that would be on the outskirts of a major city. Railroads. Who has the most railroad traffic coming in? What can we do there? The roads, the covered wagons and the horse and buggies. What is the best transportation? Chicago was pretty good running, but I'll tell you, the top 2 cities at that time were Peoria and Springfield. And it was a real neck and neck up to the last minute. And I can give you this, I can give you that, we can give you this,
wow.
Until the very end when the decision was made for Springfield. And immediately upon that decision being made, they went to work and they built it's the exposition building.
Okay.
If you come in the main gate, what is currently the main gate in Springfield, of what we now have 366 acres, that first building on the left is the exposition building. And that building is huge, and it was just an incredible building for 1894.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the exhibits and the different agricultural products that were probably brought during those times?
Sure.
Have you come across those in your research?
Yeah, in the research that I have found, mainly was fruit, vegetables, the corn stalks, how the tallest corn stalk, that was a big competition.
Really?
Yeah. Another thing, in those days, they would have singing groups, and they would have competitions for, singing groups, different church groups or local communities that would put together singing groups, small like vaudeville acts that would be put together. Sadly, they had the freak shows that were put on at that time. They were very big in horse racing. They even had dog racing, horse racing. A big competition at that time was your cattle. Who had the biggest horses? Who had the biggest cows? The most desirable pork and pigs and just different agricultural. It's just very, very much agricultural based.
Yeah. Now it seems the fair has this kind of history of contest and competition behind it. And there's some pretty big prizes behind some of these things.
Yes,
Can you kind of
very
tell
much
us a little
so.
bit about some of that?
Sure. Even the very first fair in 1853, the rewards for the different competitions, as you call them, was fairly big at the time. I have documentation from the very first fair, 1853. I have a list of every single person that won a prize. So my goal for the museum, I created a foundation 2 years ago, which we can talk about that as well. But my goal is for people to be able to do research and have it on databases where they can enter a family name from 1853 and do the genealogy work that a lot of people are into and say, oh my goodness, here we have, great-great-grandpa Gray, which is my last name, and they were at the 1853 fair as well, my husband's family, showing horses. He won a 50-cent coin piece because he had the fastest Morgan horse, or whatever it is.
Oh, that'd be neat.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
And so I have, thankfully, the Department of Agriculture did really good record keeping, and I have a listing of all those premiums, is what they call it. And in that very first year, it was $954,
Wow.
which is a lot of money in 1853. And so they would get a 50-cent piece or $1, $2 in 1853, which was very much a lot of money. Typically, as well, they would give ribbons, red ribbons, green ribbons. In fact, a few weeks ago, right before the fair started, an elderly gentleman called me from Cantrell, Illinois, and he said, ma'am, would you be interested in some books and some ribbons? And I said, well, what do you have? And he said, well, we've got a box of books, and they go back to the early 1900s, which are the premium books from the fairs. And this was an elderly gentleman in his 80s who said that, of course, he shows here at the fair. His children show at the fair. His grandchildren show at the fair. His father and mother showed at the fair. His grandparents showed at the fair, and his great-grandparents showed at the fair. So literally, there's 6 generations right there of one family just a few miles north of Springfield, Illinois, that showed in the Illinois State Fair. It's a huge thing to many, many families. So I met with him, and he brought the books, and lo and behold, in one of the boxes of ribbons that they had in their barn was a ribbon from 1899. And I treasure that ribbon because ribbons, that's one of my favorite things about the fair, because it's not a monetary prize as in cash and money, but just think of what that ribbon meant to that person that won it in 1899.
Yeah, really. Now, you were telling us about what the prizes were then. What about now? What are some of the prizes now?
Now it's a lot of cash. Even with, they had a senior spelling bee just yesterday. It's a new thing, which is pretty cool. They have senior citizens compete against each other. Instead of a 4th grade spelling bee, and they have a national contest, they had an Illinois regional contest, and those winners came to Springfield yesterday and competed in a senior citizens spelling bee. And they ended up having a tie for first place, and each one of those winners won $150.
Wow.
So that was their cash prize. Again, they have, still today, they have ribbons. And if you want, we can go around and see some of the ribbons that I've collected from donations over the years.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. You know, one of the things I'm realizing is that the state fair started with this idea of agriculture, and it's kind of exploded, and now there's all kinds of things, even to senior spelling bees. Can you kind of tell us, you know, how some of that progression and stuff?
Sure. As any, I hate to call it a company, but any entity, which there's not very many of them that's been around since 1853. Okay, this is 2,855 years ago. Okay, there's not very many entities that can sustain itself that long.
Yeah.
Very long, 10 years, 5 years, let alone 155 years. So in the very, very beginning, I think forward-thinking people saw that we cannot appeal to one group of people, i.e. as in agriculture. We need to appeal to the very young children. We need to appeal to the teenagers. We need to appeal to the young parents that have the young children. We need to appeal to the middle-aged person. We need to appeal to the senior citizens. And that is exactly what this fair does. Whether your mom brings you, and literally, I talked to a woman yesterday whose 17-year-old son won the diaper derby when he was 9 months old. And she said, I don't know if he'll let me share the photographs with you because he's a 17-year-old. She said, but give him about 20 years and we'll get that photo for you. But she has the ribbons. So literally, we have the diaper derby. We have the smile contest for young children. We have the ponytail contest to see who has the longest ponytail. All the young kids that show in the agriculture fairs, in the local county fairs in 102 counties in Illinois, they are very much a part of this fair. They go and they compete against their fellow high school students, and they win first place, second place, and then they are eligible to come to the state fair and show their cattle or whatever it is that they're showing. We have, of course, we have the beer tents now. You know, we have for a certain age group. We have the hog calling contest. We have the husband calling contest. We have just a variety of things, and we literally are able to target that age group from the very, very young to the senior citizens who compete in the spelling bee contest.
That's great.
So, yeah.
You know, in the very beginning, the very first years of the fair, it seems like agriculture was really the foundation to the
yes.
fair. How do you picture it now in terms of where is its place in the fair now?
Very, very, very high. It's not that it's not the mainstream. It is actually the majority of what the state fair is about, agriculture. For example, in a couple of days, we'll have the Grand Champion sales, where the governor comes out and they auction off the Grand Champion cattle. And it's a lot of money that is put through this fairgrounds, and people compete through all the 102 counties in whatever realm they have, you know, whether it's the feed that they have, the cattle, the horses, and then they compete with each other to come to the Grand Champion State Fair. And they do it every year. And like the gentleman that I told you about earlier, his great-grandparents, his grandparents, his parents, himself, his own children and his grandchildren, and I can be certain his great-grandchildren will. That is a family tradition, and that's what the fair is this year. The theme is a family tradition, and that is what it's about.
Well, great. You know, this is going to be an oral history interview, and it's going to be around for a long time. You've given us great stories already. And I'm just kind of wondering if there's a story or something you would like to leave in this interview for somebody else that might find it.
Absolutely. There's a couple that come to mind, although as I told you, for 14 years I have every year one or more really, really great stories, and it's hard to narrow it down. One story that I'll share with you is a woman called me over this past winter. It's a recent story, and she said that her mother had just passed away, and she found a fruit display which she grew up with. It was hanging on their kitchen wall all of this woman's life. This woman was in her 50s when she called me, and she said she wanted to donate something to our museum. And it is, I can show it to you if you want to take a film of it, but it is a plaster display. It's a plaster fruit display. It has bananas, grapes, fruit on it. And if you can picture it, it's 3D. It hangs on the wall and with a little wire hook on the back, and it hung on her kitchen wall all of this woman's life. And when she died, she finds out that she knew it as a younger child, but had, you know, over the years had forgotten about what that fruit display was. Her mother won that fruit display in 1936, when the mother was 15 years old. The mother grew up in the north end of Springfield here, large family, and the parents of this 15-year-old said, okay, you're out of school for the summer. What we're going to do is you're going to raise the fruit and you're going to display it at the Illinois State Fair. Well, this 15-year-old girl won first place that year. And you'd asked me about some of the prizes. Well, in 1936, that was her first place. It wasn't a ribbon, it wasn't a cash, it was that fruit display. And on the back of it, it has Illinois State Fair 1936. So a 15-year-old girl won it, and she had been displaying and bringing items to compete with every year prior to that. So if you put yourself back to 1936, that was a huge thing. She wasn't playing Nintendo through the summer. She wasn't on the internet in an air-conditioned house. She was tending to that garden with her parents and her family, and she won first place for that effort. She kept it, and when she later, in her later years, probably some 10 years later or so, she married. She began to have children. She had a large family herself. The woman told me they had 6 kids in her family. And she displayed it on her kitchen wall as she raised her family. And when you're raising your family, you don't tell them about all these things, you know, but she did tell them she wanted it at the state fair. But just think on a personal level what that must have meant to her to hang it on her kitchen wall literally for 68 years.
Wow.
When the woman died, her daughter brought it to us. We have it in the museum because she did not want to see this thing go in a dumpster or on the shelf of a Goodwill store or Salvation Army or a secondhand store, or literally just thrown in the trash. So I'm always about the people. I think the people, you know, that's what makes the museum what it is. And those are the kind of stories that I could probably go on and bore you for days about, because I have hundreds of those types of stories.
Yeah.
That's one of them.
That's a great one. Well, thank you very much. This was
Yes,
a lot of fun
you're
to
welcome.
stay here.